Anglo-American poet W. H. Auden's collected poetry includes work on public politics and the start of his religious imagery, reflecting the crisis of modern society. 1957 In The Hawk in the Rain, English poet Ted Hughes explores love and war through and alongside the symbolic lives of animals, showing a world of struggle mirroring the one of humanity. 1964 English poet Philip Larkin's Whitsun Weddings is a series of poems conscious of the decline of established familial and social relations. 1965 U.S. poet Sylvia Plath's Ariel, published posthumously, sees a shift to a dark and unsettling flow of imagery, borrowing from the horrors of war crimes. The political, cultural, and personal landscape of the generation of poets that sprang up after World War II was one scarred by the war's atrocities and filled with guilt. Writers and other artists had a troubled relationship with the past, whether public or personal. In the work of poets such as W. H. Auden, Ted Hughes, and Philip Larkin, personal relationships often stood in for wider interactions, and the memory of the war insinuated itself in imagery, references, poetic forms, and style. Memory and Change. The first major poetry collection by Irish poet Seamus Heaney, The Successful and Acclaimed Death of a Naturalist, explores the schism between childhood and adulthood, past and present as a version of the division between a pre-war and a post-war world. Themes and imagery invoke nature, family, human labor, and rural Irish landscapes in poems such as Blackberry Picking and Churning Day. While there is no progression of a narrative in the collection, the 34 poems all revolve around similar elements of style and thematics, with natural imagery used to highlight the effects of the war upon external and internal spaces. In the second poem, Death of a Naturalist, a boy encounters frogs that Heaney likens to grenades of mud, rupturing the childhood connection with nature. The past is also incarnated in Heaney's family members, his father in particular. In Digging, he shows their now outmoded link to manual labor and expertise in older ways of life, recalling his father digging for potatoes and his grandfather digging turf. Yet their labor, after all, is perhaps not too different from his own, as Heaney almost apologetically recognizes writing as a link to his earthier, more useful forebears. Heaney was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995, for works of lyrical beauty and ethical depth, which exalt everyday miracles and the living past. See also, The Waste Land, The Bell Jar Crow. In context. Focus New Journalism. Before. Early 1900s investigative journalists such as Lincoln Steffens and Ida M. Tarbell blend literary techniques and journalism in articles that expose corrupt business and government practices. 1962 journalist Gay Talese uses interviews, dialogue, and observation in a factual but literary article on boxer Joe Louis in Esquire magazine. After. 1970 Tom Wolfe challenges traditional journalism with radical chic and Malmoing the Flak Catchers, reporting in a lively observational style. 1972 Hunter S. Thompson publishes The Drug-Fueled Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, the genesis of gonzo journalism, in which the writer plays an integral part in the story. The term new journalism was introduced by critics in the 1960s to describe the work of U.S. writers such as Truman Capote, Norman Mailer, Tom Wolfe, and Gay Talese, who used literary techniques to relate non-fictional stories and present factual reporting dramatically. Capote's theory that journalism could be forced to yield a new art form, that a non-fiction novel, lay at the heart of his book In Cold Blood. In 1959 Capote had read a newspaper report that offered an ideal subject on which to exercise his theory. A wealthy Kansas farmer, Herbert Clutter, and members of his family had been shot dead for no apparent reason. Assisted by his friend, author Harper Lee, Capote visited the scene and began researching the murder. In Cold Blood was published 7 years later. I thought that Mr. Clutter was a very nice gentleman. I thought so right up to the moment that I cut his throat. In Cold Blood. Murder in Kansas. The book describes the murder, which occurred on November 15, 1959. There were 4 victims: 48-year-old Clutter, a church-going, hard-working man, his wife, Bonnie, his daughter, Nancy, and his son, Kenyon. The family were well respected and popular. Their brutal slaying shocked the community. A local man said they were gentle, kindly people I knew, murdered. In contrast, the two murderers, Richard Dick Hickok and Perry Smith, were ex-convicts, misfits on parole from the Kansas State Penitentiary. Dick's promise to Perry was that they would blast hair all over them walls. The two were caught and arrested in Las Vegas on December 30, 1959. Capote immersed himself in his subject, spending time with friends and relatives of the victims, local residents, police, prison warders, psychiatrists, and the murderers themselves. He did not record interviews, but scribbled down quotes and impressions afterwards. Truth and embellishment. The end result is a remarkable work in which Capote constructs scene after scene, building up characters and allowing participants to tell their stories in their own words. The book was first serialized in the New Yorker magazine, and was an instant success. U.S. journalist Jack Olson said it was the first book to make true crime a successful, commercial genre. Even so, Capote was accused of having falsified or exaggerated events. He denied this falsification, though there is some evidence of embellishment. Tom Wolfe wrote that In Cold Blood had given new journalism an overwhelming momentum, and he went on to codify the features of the form in his 1973 book, The New Journalism. He stated that Capote's novel incorporated all the form's key techniques: first-hand witnessing of events, real dialogue, third-person narrative, and detailed description of minute life details, such as how the killers brushed their teeth. This created a near-factual reportage presented in the style of a novel, enabling readers to gain an understanding of events and characters that was all the more powerful for being based on real events. Truman Capote. Born Truman Streckfus Persons in New Orleans on September 30, 1924, Capote had a troubled childhood. His parents divorced when he was 4, and he was raised by relatives. He then rejoined his mother and her second husband, Joseph Capote, attending school in New York City and Greenwich, Connecticut. His career began with a string of short stories published in magazines such as Harper's Bazaar and The New Yorker. His first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, was published in 1948 and established him as a significant writer. Capote was a controversial figure. A socialite, heavy drinker, and sometime drug user, he enjoyed a flamboyant lifestyle and lived openly as a gay man, which was unusual at that time. In later life he became reclusive, and died in Los Angeles on August 25, 1984. Other key works: 1945 Miriam, 1951 The Grass Harp, 1958 Breakfast at Tiffany's. 1986 Answered Prayers, the unfinished novel. See also, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Armies of the Night, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. In context. Focus. The Latin American boom before 1946. 49 Guatemalan Miguel Angel Asturias blends modernist techniques with surrealism and folklore in Mr. President and Men of Maze. 1962 In the Death of Artemio Cruz, Carlos Fuentes layers memory, poetic imagery, stream of consciousness, and multiple perspectives to explore corruption in Mexico. 1963 Argentinian Julio Cortázar allows readers to choose their own path through his radically experimental work Hopscotch. After 1969 The Shattered Society of 1950s, Peru is revealed at lightning speed in a discussion between two men of different classes in Mario Vargas Llosa's Conversation in the Cathedral. As its name suggests, the Latin American boom was an explosion of literary creativity that occurred in South America in the 1960s. Although Jorge Luis Borges had ignited a slow-burning fuse some 20 years before with Fictions, a puzzle box of short stories that broke all literary conventions, the boom years saw the publication of stellar works that gained worldwide attention for authors such as Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Julio Cortázar, and Mario Vargas Llosa. These intellectuals engaged with the political struggles of Latin America. Their writing was fueled by the counterculture of the 1960s, and their narratives frequently make use of innovative and experimental techniques such as nonlinear time, shifting perspectives, and magic realism, a technique regarded by many to be an invention of South American literature. Time was not passing. It was turning in a circle. 100 Years of Solitude. Isolation. Often considered the masterwork of the boom, Colombian Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude brings together Bible stories, ancient myths, and South American traditions of magic, resurrection, and regeneration in a metaphorical commentary on the continent's history. The story spans 1 century and 7 generations of a single family, the Buendias. Macondo, the town that they found, represents the history of Colombia at large. At the story's opening, Macondo is a small village of adobe houses, wedged between mountains and swamp. Its isolation from the modern world is complete, no route stretches back over the mountains. Established by José Arcadio Buendia and his wife Ursula Iguaran, it is a utopia where everyone is younger than 30 years old and no one has yet died. José Arcadio and Ursula have 2 sons, a lusty giant, also called José Arcadio, and his anxious, prescient brother Aureliano. Their names, physical traits, and personalities are repeated down the generations, while characters such as Pilar Ternera, the village prostitute, both enrich the gene pool and complicate it by coupling with and bearing children for multiple Buendias. Through all this complexity, the beating heart of Macondo is always the matriarch Ursula, whose long life allows her to protect and maintain the Buendia family in every new generation after each invasion of incomers and the episodes of insanity that follow them. Invasion. Each generation is faced with its own fresh catastrophe, many of which parody an episode in Latin American history or reflect the continent's rich tradition of myth and legend. Although he is an artist at heart, Aureliano is soon caught up in civil wars that ravage the country for years. He becomes a famous colonel, renowned throughout the land as much for his poetry as his military exploits. All Aureliano's victories come to nothing, however, as the country remains convulsed by conflict, a parody of the bloody struggles that racked Latin America in the 19th century. The wars bring death and violence to the previously peaceful Macondo, and Aureliano's nephew Arcadio becomes a dictatorial governor until he is shot by a firing squad. The town has been changed forever, and the opening of a new railway exposes Macondo to the influence of the outside world for the first time. At first the villagers are enthralled by the wonders of modernity. They cannot understand how an actor who dies in one movie can come back to life to appear in another, but Macondo soon becomes an outpost of U.S. economic imperialism. The American Fruit Company turns the town into a banana plantation, controlled by a small encampment of Americans. When the workers go on strike for better conditions, they are massacred in an episode that forms the violent catalyst of the town's final decline. The misery inflicted on Macondo represents the centuries of pain caused by Western economic exploitation. Even a rainstorm that lasts for 4 years, 11 months, and 2 days, fails to wash the town clean. It does, however, cause an exodus, leaving Macondo empty apart from a handful of Buendias living out their final days in the town. The house in Aractica, Colombia, where Gabriel Garcia Marquez grew up is now a pilgrimage site for fans of the author, who come to visit the place that inspired the creation of Macondo. Bible stories and myths. Marquez draws on South America's mixed heritage of myths and Bible tales to tell the story of a paradise destroyed through its loss of innocence. In Macondo, the world was so recent that many things lacked names. The novel's exploration of the history of human progress therefore begins with an idiosyncratic Buendia creation myth. The family's founding marriage is a union between the cousins José Arcadio and Ursula, and the story of a previous Buendia incest that produced a child with a pig's tail becomes an ever-present anxiety. As it turns out, this fear was entirely justified. The final Aureliano is born with the feared affliction. There are several Inca creation myths founded on incest between brother and sister, and the natural progression of family from Adam and Eve in the Bible would have progressed along similar lines. Some 17th century arrivals in South America believed that the Garden of Eden was sited in eastern Bolivia. The first conquistadors thought they had discovered a people descended from the son of Noah, a survivor of the Great Flood, or possibly from the lost tribes of Israel. Deluge myths were widespread among indigenous South American people. These bubbled to the surface in the Great Rain towards the end of 100 Years of Solitude. The same names recur across the 7 generations of the Buendia family with bewildering regularity. This family tree depicts the various relationships of the Buendias with family members in yellow boxes and incestuous couplings shown by yellow lines. Science and magic. Magic is not sprinkled lightly across this novel, it is woven into the fabric of its lilting, poetic text. At first, the villagers are mystified by modern phenomena such as false teeth and photographs. But even when the modernization of Macondo is well underway, the forces of magic carry just as much weight as reason and science. Remedios the beauty, a woman too beautiful to be looked upon, rises to heaven in a cloud of bedsheets. After the first José Arcadio descends into madness, he becomes literally bonded to the chestnut tree in his garden, and when he is taken indoors the smell of mushrooms and woodflower fungus follows him. As Ursula ages and her sight fades, the lucidity of her old age allows her to see, and she develops her other senses. Using odors to remember sights, she tracks a child's movements by sprinkling a little rosewater on his head, and she distinguishes color by texture. Garcia Marquez said that he discovered the key to handling the narrative voice in his novel in his grandmother's stories and from an aunt who had a knack for offering fantastical explanations with the conviction of the truth. The last that remained of a past whose annihilation had not taken place because it was still in a process of annihilation. 100 Years of Solitude. Resurrection. In 100 Years of Solitude the dead continue to exert an influence on the living and the grave is a door to multiple realities beyond our own. Early in the story José Arcadio Buendia throws a spear through the throat of Prudencio Aguilar, a neighbor who insults him. José Arcadio is then haunted by the man's spirit until he is on his own deathbed. The two men make plans for a bird-breeding farm in the afterlife so that they will have something to do on the tedious Sundays of death. The fixation on death persists when distant relative Rebecca arrives at the Buendia house dragging a bag of her parents' bones. She eats earth and lime, the stuff of the grave, while she awaits their proper burial. Circular time. Fractured or nonlinear time is a key feature of the Latin American boom's postmodernist approach to literature. The opening lines set this up in a very memorable way. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. Time is cyclical in the story. Present, past, and future events are commingled in the 100-year span of the Buendia family. The setting, too, is circular. All of the action takes place within concentric spheres. First, the modern world that is encroaching on Macondo, then the village itself, the Buendia's house, and finally the mysterious laboratory that is established in the heart of the house and which remains untouched by the passing of time. Rescued from the firing squad, Aureliano retreats there to fashion tiny gold fishes, which he then melts down and makes all over again in an attempt to live forever in the present moment, a bitter reflection of the futile repetitions of the story and of human history. When the last Buendia is drawn to the laboratory to finally unravel the scrolls which document and prophesy Macondo's 100-year history, and which were delivered to the first José Arcadio by the gypsy Melquiades, he finds prehistoric plants and luminous insects have removed all trace of man's passage on earth from the room. As he reads he finds himself deciphering the instant that he was living, deciphering it as he lived it. Prophesying himself in the act of deciphering the last page of the parchments, as if he were looking into a speaking mirror. In this extraordinary metafictional moment the narrator, character, and reader arrive at the point at which past, present, and future combine and fall into the void beyond which the words stop on the page. 100 Years of Solitude has sold more than 30 million copies and is regarded as a masterpiece of a literary boom that reverberated across 2 decades. Marquez's postmodern vision spoke to both Latin America and the wider world in its depiction of a planet that is doomed to repeat a cycle of endless environmental catastrophe, warfare, and infighting over and over for generation after generation. A banana plantation is established in Macondo, and the American Fruit Company's economic imperialism leads to a massacre and reflects the USA's exploitation of Latin America. Races condemned to 100 years of solitude did not have a second opportunity on Earth. 100 Years of Solitude. Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Born in Colombia in 1928, Gabriel José Garcia Marquez was raised by his grandparents in Aractica, a town resembling the fictional Macondo of 100 Years of Solitude. This upbringing shaped his anti-imperialist beliefs. During the violence, a 10-year period of political repression in Colombia, Garcia Marquez became a reporter in Barranquilla. Although Garcia Marquez's journalism flourished, His liberal views meant that he had to leave Colombia and work as a foreign correspondent in Europe. After reporting on the Cuban Revolution in 1959, he worked in Bogotá and New York for Prensa Latina, the Cuban news agency. His second full novel, 100 Years of Solitude, was written in Mexico City and earned the author worldwide acclaim. Márquez authored 22 books and was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1982. He died in Mexico City in 2014. Other key works: 1985 Love in the Time of Cholera, 2004 Memoirs of My Melancholy Whores. See also, Fictions Hopscotch, Pedro Páramo, The Death of Artemio Cruz, The Time of the Hero, Midnight's Children, The House of the Spirits, Love in the Time of Cholera, 2666. Further reading: Paroles. Jacques Prévert. Paroles is the first poetry collection by the French poet and screenwriter Prévert. Comprising 95 poems of varying length, it reveals multiple elements of his trademark writing style, such as wordplay, prose poems, puns, and mini-dialogues. The collection covers a variety of subjects and themes, entwining everyday life in post-war Paris with sentiments of anti-war protest, critiques of both religion and politics, and a reflection of the role of art in society. Cry, The Beloved Country. Alan Paton. The masterpiece of South African author Paton focuses on Stephen Kimelo, a black Anglican priest in Johannesburg who is in search of his son, who has been involved in the murder of a white activist for racial justice. It also tells the story of the activist's father, and how his own prejudices and views are changed by his son's death and writing, and by meeting Kimelo. Paton's narrative reveals the changing reality of South Africa on the verge of apartheid. Snow Country. Yasunari Kawabata. Japanese novelist Yasunari Kawabata is a Nobel laureate. One of his most famous novels, Snow Country, tells of doomed love amid the mountains of western Japan. Shimamura, a bored, wealthy businessman, meets Kamako, a beautiful but forlorn geisha at a hot spring resort. The landscape becomes a metaphor for feelings, including hopelessness and isolation. Kawabata's focus on the personal, with no mention of the fighting in World War II, which was raging at the time of writing, may have been a conscious artistic response to the conflict. The train came out of the long border tunnel, and there was the snow country. The night had turned white. Snow Country, Yasunari Kawabata. The Lagoon and Other Stories. Janet Frame. A collection of short stories, this was the first publication by New Zealand author Frame. To varying extents, the texts in the collection question their own status as fiction, explore the author's agency and identity, and experiment with narrative voice. The book's publication and critical reception, including a highly regarded literary prize, were crucial in saving Frame from a lobotomy and a series of atrocious practices in mental institutions, where she had been committed. The Old Man and the Sea. Ernest Hemingway. Written during Hemingway's stay in Cuba in 1951, The Old Man and the Sea was the last piece of fiction to be published during the author's lifetime. The story is as simple as the writing style, depicting the struggle of old fisherman Santiago with a marlin off the coasts of Cuba and Florida. Nevertheless, the work is deeply emotional and powerful, as both the Pulitzer and Nobel Commissions acknowledged in their awards to Hemingway. Multiple interpretations of the book have been suggested, such as that it is a reflection on the author's career, that it has an allegorical religious significance, or that it is a personal story based on people Hemingway encountered during his life. Ernest Hemingway. Born in Illinois, USA, in 1899, Hemingway discovered his affinity for writing early in life as a reporter for the Kansas City Star. He later served as a volunteer ambulance driver in World War I in Italy, from where he returned wounded in 1918. His first novel, The Sun Also Rises, was written while working as an overseas correspondent in Paris. Establishing himself in Europe, Hemingway saw increasing success from his short stories and novels and traveled widely to pursue, among other interests, his love of hunting, a subject that would appear in many of his stories. He returned to journalism to report on the Spanish Civil War and the Normandy landings, and won the Nobel Prize in 1954. Hemingway committed suicide in Idaho in 1961. Key works: 1929 A Farewell to Arms 1940 For Whom the Bell Tolls 1952 The Old Man and the Sea. Fahrenheit 451. Ray Bradbury. One of the most famous novels by the U.S. writer of speculative fiction Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451 is a key example of dystopian fiction. In a world in which knowledge and books are banned, Guy Montag, a fireman, slowly rediscovers his own humanity and individuality. The story highlights the conflict between mindlessly following orders and questioning established power structures, and the role that books and knowledge can play in that ongoing struggle. A book is a loaded gun in the house next door. Who knows who might be the target of the well-read man? Fahrenheit 451 Ray Bradbury. Lord of the Flies. William Golding. Despite its initial lack of success, Lord of the Flies has since become a classic and fundamental text of dystopian, allegorical, political, and satirical writing. The story begins with a group of boys stranded on an otherwise unpopulated island, and follows their unsuccessful, violent, and ultimately savage attempts to impose different types of self-government and order on the group. The story takes place in the shadow of a rotting pig's skull surrounded by insects, the eponymous Lord of the Flies of the title. Although Golding's first novel has often been challenged for its controversial exploration of human nature, utilitarian themes, and violence, it is nevertheless a fascinating insight into political, psychological, and philosophical thought of its time. William Golding. Golding was born near the British town of Newquay, Cornwall, in September 1911. He grew up in a political household in Wiltshire. His father, Alec, was a science master, a socialist, and a rationalist, while his mother, Mildred Curnow, was a female suffrage activist. Golding studied natural sciences, then English literature at Oxford. He served in the Royal Navy during World War II, and published his first work of fiction, Lord of the Flies, in 1954. He kept writing until his death in 1993, and was awarded both the Booker and Nobel Prizes. Key works: 1954 Lord of the Flies, 1955 The Inheritors, 1980, 1987, 1989 To the Ends of the Earth, a Sea Trilogy. The Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien. English writer and academic Tolkien helped to redevelop the fantasy genre with the 3-volume sequel to his children's book The Hobbit. Taking inspiration from events in the World Wars, his childhood in South Africa, and his studies in Icelandic and Germanic literatures, he developed the epic tale of The Lord of the Rings. The story follows multiple characters as they journey through the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, and the Return of the King, in a life-or-death quest to end the spread of evil forces across Middle-earth. Pedro Páramo. Juan Rulfo. Influencing writers such as Gabriel García Márquez and José Saramago, Pedro Páramo by Mexican author Juan Rulfo is a surreal, supernatural, and enigmatic story of grief, haunting memories, and deeply fraught relationships. Through nonlinear storytelling, the blurring of events, dreams, and hallucinations, the reader is dragged into the confusion of the narrator Juan Preciado. He tells of his return to the ghost town of Kamala after his mother's death to fulfill her last wish, to find his father, Pedro Páramo. Juan is shocked to discover the extent of Páramo's influence in the town. As the narrative unfolds, Páramo is revealed as protagonist and antagonist of the story, holding the power of life and death over Kamala and its inhabitants. Memed, My Hawk. Yasar Kemal. Kemal's first full novel, Memed, My Hawk, originally titled Ins Memed, was the first Turkish-language book to achieve international fame. The first volume in a series of 4, it follows the troubled story of young Anatolian Mehmed, who runs from his abusers with his loved one Hatice, loses her, and joins a band of brigands. He returns to his mother and hometown to challenge the abusive landowner who caused Hatice's death, and discovers that his story has only just begun. Yasar Kemal. Born in Gökçem, Turkey, in 1923, Kemal experienced childhood hardships that may have contributed to his later urge to speak out on behalf of the dispossessed. He was blinded in one eye as a child, and suffered the tragedy of witnessing his father's murder at the age of 5. He first met with literary acclaim with his short stories and novels, which he wrote in the 1950s and 60s while working as a journalist. He also wrote ballads and children's books. Kemal was awarded 38 literary prizes throughout his career, and was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 1973. He died in 2015. Key works: 1954 The Drumming Out, 1955 Memed, My Hawk, 1969 They Burn the Thistles. The Devil to Pay in the Backlands. João Guimarães Rosa. A major work of South American literature, The Devil to Pay in the Backlands, by Brazilian writer João Guimarães Rosa, is narrated by ex-mercenary Riobaldo as a long and continuous tale, with no section breaks. It is the story of the narrator's life, his encounters with turncoat ranchers and other brigands, and the devil himself, as they all cross paths, literally and metaphorically, in the outback of the Brazilian state Minas Gerais. Howl and Other Poems. Allen Ginsberg. The first and most significant collection by U.S. poet Ginsberg, and the most influential for the Beat Generation movement. Containing among other poems the epic Howl, Ginsberg's pieces are raw and emotional, and openly condemn consumer capitalism, homophobia, racism, and cultural hegemony in the U.S. The book's publisher was charged with obscenity, but won the case, which only served to increase demand for the book and boost circulation both in the USA and across the world. Dr. Zhivago. Boris Pasternak. The internationally acclaimed novel Dr. Zhivago by Russian writer Pasternak is a thought-provoking investigation of the Russian Communist Party between the Revolution of 1905 and World War I. It had to be published in Italy due to censorship by the Russian government, which also removed the Nobel Prize awarded to Pasternak. The story is told through multiple characters, centered around Yuri Zhivago, as they adapt to the new political reality of their country. It deals with the regime's misguided attempts to impose conformity and its misreadings of socialist ideals, as well as the characters' struggles in their attempts to deal with and overcome the alienation, loneliness, and coldness of communist Russia. La Jalousie. Alain Robbe-Grillet. An experimental French Nouveau Roman, La Jalousie by Robbe-Grillet features a narrator who is effectively absent, although his presence is implied, from the events he describes. He spies, out of jealousy, on his wife through jealousy, a type of window. Scenes are repeated multiple times, with some of the details changed. Ambiguous and fragmented, the work is an example of the author's experimentation with the novel form. The reader is left to interpret the story for themselves. She begins serving the cognac, then the soda, and finally 3 transparent ice cubes, each of which imprisons a bundle of silver needles in its heart. La Jalousie, Alain Robbe-Grillet. A House for Mr. Biswas. V. S. Naipaul. The first novel by Trinidad-born British writer Naipaul to achieve international acclaim, A House for Mr. Biswas draws on the author's experiences of growing up in the Caribbean. Mohan Biswas strives towards his goal of owning his own house, to provide a home for his family and escape from his overbearing in-laws. The book lays bare the inequalities of colonialism, and exposes the tensions between individual and familial life. The Time Regulation Institute. Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar. Tanpınar wrote The Time Regulation Institute as a critique of the excessive bureaucracy in modern governmental procedures, basing many of his observations on his native Turkey. This major Turkish-language novel recounts the protagonist's personal struggles to adapt to the Eurasian post-war reality, and to be at peace with the changing nature of modern times. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. An active critic of the totalitarian government ruling over his native Russia, Solzhenitsyn wrote this, his first literary work, to openly condemn Stalin's rule. The book recounts a day in the life of a wrongly condemned labor camp prisoner, Ivan Denisovich, and the nature of the punishments, hardships, and horrors that he endures. The underlying message, however, is one of solidarity, loyalty, and humanity among the prisoners, who only survive from day to day by working together. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Ken Kesey. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by U.S. writer Kesey is a novel set in a mental institution in Oregon, and is based on the author's own time as a staff member at a similar facility. Although the novel has been well received in most quarters, it has also been subject to bans. Kesey's best-known book, it highlights the humanity, and in some cases, cruelty, behind the individuals, from patients to staff, in the mental care system. It is often seen as a critique of this type of institution, as well as of other systems of control in U.S. society. A Clockwork Orange. Anthony Burgess. In this dystopian novel, Burgess takes his observations of the changing youth cultures present in Britain in the 1960s to disturbing extremes. The reader follows the teenage narrator Alex in his exploits of ultraviolence, depravity, and drug use, told in both English and the Russian-influenced teen slang known as nadsat. Also described are the authorities' attempts to reform Alex through an experimental type of aversion therapy, no matter the cost to his mental state. The final chapter, cut from U.S. editions until the 1980s, seems to show some redemption for Alex. The satirical novel spawned an extremely successful and equally controversial cinematic adaptation in 1971 by Stanley Kubrick, which helped to increase the popularity of and interest in the book. If he can only perform good or only perform evil, then he is a clockwork orange. An organism lovely with color and juice, but only a clockwork toy to be wound up by God or the devil. A Clockwork Orange. Anthony Burgess. The Death of Artemio Cruz. Carlos Fuentes. One of the novels that helped bring Latin American literature to wider international recognition, The Death of Artemio Cruz by Mexican author Fuentes is a recollection of the life of fictional main character Artemio Cruz, as he lies on his deathbed. Through the memories of Cruz, the reader joins his greedy family, overbearing priest, and not too loyal assistant in revisiting over 60 years of Mexican history, politics, and religion, including the country's foreign policies, corruption, and betrayals. The Bell Jar. Sylvia Plath. This semi-autobiographical novel by U.S. poet Sylvia Plath retells events in the author's life, and was initially published under a pseudonym. The text is made up of multiple flashbacks to protagonist Esther's earlier life, as she interns for a renowned magazine in New York one summer. Esther, in search of her own identity as a woman, descends into a worsening mental state, eventually ending up in a mental hospital and being treated with electroshock therapy. I felt very still and very empty, moving dully along in the middle of the surrounding hullabaloo. The Bell Jar. Sylvia Plath. The Time of the Hero. Mario Vargas Llosa. The heavily censored literary debut of Peruvian Nobel Prize winner Mario Vargas Llosa. The Time of the Hero is an experimental work of fiction. Employing multiple perspectives and a complex, nonlinear chronology, the story is set in a real-life military academy in Lima. It exposes the techniques used to train cadets, turning them into loyal, silent, hypermasculine drones, never questioning or challenging imposed structures of authority. In turn, these practices are not solely seen as issues of the academy, but also of more general military structures, and of a state that relies on military power to maintain control, such as in Peru from the 1930s to the 1980s. The authorities attempted to prevent the novel's publication, condemning it as a plot by neighboring Ecuador to denigrate the nation of Peru. The Crying of Lot 49. Thomas Pynchon. Written by New Yorker and author of speculative fiction Pynchon, this novella was hailed as both a prime example and a harsh parody of postmodern fiction and psychoanalysis. It follows Oedipa Maas and her discovery of a worldwide conspiracy rooted in a centuries-old feud between two postal services, one real, one fictional. The text is littered with cultural and social references to popular music, literature, and art. Wide Sargasso Sea. Jean Rhys. A powerful novel by Dominica-born British writer Jean Rhys, Wide Sargasso Sea explores feminist and post-colonial themes through relationships of power, especially between men and women. The story, a prequel to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, follows white Creole Antoinette and her troubled life in Jamaica, as she is controlled, oppressed, then dismissed as a mad woman by her English husband, before being forced to relocate to England under the name of Bertha. We stared at each other, blood on my face, tears on hers. It was as if I saw myself, like in a looking glass. Wide Sargasso Sea. Jean Rhys. The Master and Margarita. Mikhail Bulgakov. Written by Russian author Bulgakov between 1928 and 1940 but only published almost 30 years later, The Master and Margarita is set both in 1930s Moscow and, as told in a novel by lead character The Master, in Jerusalem at the time of Christ. Through both storylines, the book can be seen as a historical validation of religious tenets, a critique of overly bureaucratic rules, and a satire of the Soviet authorities, catalyzed in the characters of Professor Woland, an anarchic but scholarly manifestation of Satan, and his devilish entourage. The Armies of the Night. Norman Mailer. Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Armies of the Night, History as a Novel. The novel as history, by journalist, playwright, novelist, and filmmaker Norman Mailer, was a key work in the rise and acceptance of creative non-fiction in the literary landscape. The text is a historicized, political, journalistic recollection of an anti-Vietnam War rally in Washington, D.C., in 1967, interspersed with self-reflections, novelizations, and personal thoughts on the subject matter and the author himself. Norman Mailer. Born in New Jersey, USA, in 1923, Mailer grew up in New York. He joined Harvard University at the age of just 16, initially to study aeronautical engineering, but soon became interested in writing. One of his stories won a competition in 1941, which led him to pursue writing seriously, an ambition that he argued should exempt him from military service. His first novel The Naked and the Dead is based on his war experience in the Philippines. In 1955 he co-founded the political arts magazine The Village Voice. A cultural commentator and critic, Mailer also wrote biographies of Picasso, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Marilyn Monroe. His creative non-fiction, political activism, and 2 Pulitzer Prizes ensured his fame. He died in 2007. Key works: 1957, The White Negro. 1968, The Armies of the Night. 1979, The Executioner's Song. Slaughterhouse-Five. Kurt Vonnegut. Written by U.S. author Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse-Five or The Children's Crusade, A Duty Dance with Death is a key example of speculative fiction and surreal political satire. It meshes together time travel and its paradoxes, alien creatures, and semi-autobiographical notes about the author's service in World War II, including the bombing of Dresden. The result is a critique of the horrors of war, the publishing industry, and the status of literature, and is a thoughtful, almost comic, meditation on death and mortality. The French Lieutenant's Woman. John Fowles. This popular and highly acclaimed novel by British author John Fowles is often labeled as a postmodern historical fiction. It tells the story of naturalist Charles Smithson and Sarah Woodruff, a former governess, in a style that comments upon Victorian romances, while dealing with topics such as gender issues, history, science, and religion. The narrator, who also becomes a character, allows for multiple possible endings to the story, destabilizing the linear narrative of the texts it is imitating. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Maya Angelou. The first book of a 7-volume autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, the African-American Pulitzer Prize winner and activist, expresses the author's changing responses to the violence of racism. A powerful and influential literary work as well as a candid memoir of Angelou's early life in Arkansas from ages 3 to 16, the book explores issues of childhood, trauma, and motherhood, and proclaims the power of belief in oneself and of literature and the written word. Crow. Ted Hughes. Often regarded as the most important collection of the British poet Ted Hughes, Crow, From the Life and Songs of the Crow was inspired by U.S. artist Leonard Baskin's illustrations of the bird. The poems, some of which are traditional in style, while others take more experimental forms, follow the character of Crow, weaving elements of world mythologies and religions into an ongoing epic folktale. While the tale is incomplete, Hughes was unable to continue after the suicide of his lover Asha Wevel in 1969. The ambitious collection is a noteworthy philosophical and literary reflection on mythology and the natural world. Introduction. Towards the end of the 20th century, the world was becoming a smaller place. The accelerating pace of technological advances, particularly in transport and communications, brought about a globalization of trade and cultures on a scale never seen before. Political changes, most noticeably the liberalization of Eastern European communist bloc countries and the lifting of the Iron Curtain, also helped to foster ever greater international links. At the same time as nations around the globe developed their own distinct post-colonial cultures, Europe and North America became influenced by multiculturalism, which led to a realization within the West that its culture could no longer be considered a benchmark for the rest of the world. This was a period in which the first generation of writers to have been born in nations that had gained independence from the European empires came of age. Many writers admired the new techniques of postmodernism that some South American authors had adopted as a style, and especially the genre of magic realism. The English language still dominated the literary world, however, and it was people from the old British Empire who came to prominence in the first wave of post-colonial literature. New national voices. India produced authors such as Salman Rushdie and Vikram Seth who, writing in English, portrayed the experiences of the new India after independence and partition. Local voices also emerged in other former outposts of empire, including the Caribbean poet Derek Walcott and the novelist V.S. Naipaul. In Canada, Australia, and South Africa, where many people had resettled from the UK, British influence on writing waned and literature began to appear that was recognizably of those nations. New styles of writing were also emerging in East Asia, as writers sought to establish a national identity in a modern China after the upheaval of the Cultural Revolution, and in a Korea that was now divided into an authoritarian North and a liberal South by the 38th parallel. Multiculturalism. While European culture was losing its monopoly in its old colonies, it was also being influenced by rising numbers of immigrants from around the world. Many cities in Europe became cosmopolitan centers, attracting not only people in search of a new life and a better standard of living, but also writers and artists who still regarded Europe as an intellectual center. Ironically, many writers who had helped to establish a literary style in their homeland, such as Rushdie, Seth, and Naipaul, had chosen to settle in England, where their presence inspired younger writers, many of whom were the offspring of immigrants from the Indian subcontinent, Africa, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. Such authors described the complex experiences of living in multicultural cities, with Zadie Smith exploring the integration of immigrants into British society. In the USA, however, issues of race and cultural assimilation had a longer history. U.S. society had long been based on the model of its European settlers' homelands, while a quite separate culture had developed among the African American descendants of slaves. Even after many of the political goals of the civil rights movement had been achieved, racial tensions persisted, and this was reflected in a distinctive body of literature by writers such as Toni Morrison. International literature. Alongside the development of new national voices, a global trend of adopting postmodern stylistic techniques gave much of the era's literature an international appeal. The counterculture of the 1960s broke down the barriers between serious and popular culture, while sophisticated computing and telecommunications technologies were the inspiration for novels such as U.S. author Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. Magic realism in particular had become a widely accepted genre, yet new writing continued to draw upon older forms, such as in the allegorical satire of José Saramago and the metafiction of Italo Calvino. While English is now a second language for numerous people across the world, many novels are also available in translation. The modern readership is international, and authors, no longer restricted by regional boundaries, are quick to reflect on ideas and issues that have global resonance, such as the dysfunctions in modern society and the threat posed by terrorism. In context. Focus. The encyclopedic novel before 1851. Herman Melville's Moby Dick is the first great encyclopedic American novel. 1963. Thomas Pynchon's debut novel V anticipates Gravity's Rainbow in its panoramic and information-packed scope. After 1996. Dealing with addiction, family relationships, tennis, entertainment, advertising, Quebecois separatism, and film theory, the encyclopedic novel Infinite Jest, by U.S. writer David Foster Wallace, has 388 endnotes. 1997. Using baseball, and one baseball in particular, as its central conceit, U.S. author Don DeLillo's complex novel Underworld stretches from the 1950s to the 1990s and involves both fictional and historical characters. The term encyclopedic novel refers to a capacious, complex work of fiction that includes swathes of specialized information on subjects ranging from science to the arts to history. It attempts to create, through a virtuoso effort of imagination, a fictional world beyond the reach of linear storytelling. In his novel Moby Dick, Herman Melville combined, among other things, biblical and Shakespearean references, facts about whales, and realistic descriptions of life on board a ship. In Gravity's Rainbow, set at the end of World War II, Thomas Pynchon interweaves wartime secret operations with pop culture, surrealism, perverse eroticism, rocket science, and mathematics. Determinism and disorder. Within a formidably complex plot, with shifts in time and around 400 characters, the novel is a display of prodigious erudition. Its themes include paranoia, determinism, death, and entropy, a term from thermodynamics that indicates a steady decline into disorder. The central symbol in the book is the German V-2 rocket, an image both of transcendence and of a frightening, unknown future. The book's opening words describe the sound of a V-2 hitting London. A screaming comes across the sky. Symmetrically, at the end of the novel, a rocket is about to detonate. In between, numerous plots and subplots propel the characters through a succession of wildly improbable scenarios, in which paranoia and fear of death are often rendered with black humor. The book's main plot lines revolve around the quest by several characters to uncover the secret of a V-2 rocket numbered 00000. One such character is an American GI, Tyrone Slothrop, whose sexual encounters in London occur at the precise sites where V-2 rockets will fall. Slothrop later rescues a Dutch girl named Koch, who is a double agent, from an octopus conditioned to attack her. The octopus has been trained by Laszlo Jamf, who had conducted Pavlovian experiments on Slothrop as a child and is the inventor of an erotic plastic from which a capsule in rocket 00000 is made. When the rocket is launched, a young boy, Gottfried, is strapped inside this capsule. He is the sex slave of the book's Nazi archvillain, who by sacrificing Gottfried seeks to transcend his mortality. Such bizarre scenes are shot through with a profusion of ideas, including allusions to science and philosophy. The reader, like Slothrop, struggles to find meaning. The sheer scale and complexity of Gravity's Rainbow make it notoriously resistant to interpretation. It is possible to tease out themes by looking at the symbolic implications of the rainbow, and their opposites, and pinpointing their relevance to the novel. Paranoid truth-seeking. All systems by which we might make sense of our lives, whether they are scientific, mystical, religious, or political, are described at a certain point in the novel as paranoid. Against human attempts at rationalization, Pynchon posits a complex reality in which events occur according to inscrutable laws, while perhaps entertaining the idea that true paranoia lies in precisely such a worldview. In his short story, The Secret Integration, white schoolchildren with a black imaginary friend experience adult racism, after which their dreams could never again be entirely safe. Gravity's Rainbow traces a parallel loss of innocence on a massive scale, and Pynchon no doubt relished the idea that reading itself could no longer be entirely safe after his virtuoso feat of fictional black magic. The V-2 rocket is a key presence in Gravity's Rainbow, which features a project to assemble one, while embracing a profusion of chaos, perversity, and paranoia. Thomas Pynchon. Born in 1937 in Long Island, New York, Thomas Pynchon counts among his ancestors the founder of Springfield, Massachusetts, USA. Pynchon attended the high school in Oyster Bay, and went on to study engineering physics at Cornell University, but left before graduating to serve in the U.S. Navy. He returned to Cornell to study English. In the early 1960s, Pynchon worked as a technical writer at Boeing in Seattle. He would later draw upon his experiences there in his fiction. He spent some time in Mexico before moving to California. After Gravity's Rainbow, his fiction became less stylistically challenging and more humanistic and political. Pynchon is known for being protective of his privacy and shy of media coverage. Other key works: 1966 The Crying of Lot 49, 1984 Slow Learner, 2006 Against the Day, 2013 Bleeding Edge. See also, Moby Dick, Les Miserables, War and Peace, Ulysses, Catch 22 Infinite Jest. In context. Focus metafiction. Before 1615. In the second part of the novel Don Quixote, by Spanish writer Miguel de Cervantes, the eponymous fictional hero is aware that the first part had been written about him. 1759, 67. Anglo-Irish novelist Lawrence Sterne's fictional autobiography Tristram Shandy contains so many digressions that the author is not born until Volume 3. 1944. Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges fictions plays with the nature of fiction in a series of enigmatic and mesmerizing short stories. After 1987. U.S. author Paul Auster's The New York Trilogy twists the form of the detective novel and makes the reader question the tropes of the genre. The term metafiction was coined by U.S. writer William H. Gass in 1970 and refers to a fictional form of writing in which a series of literary tools are employed by writers to draw attention to how fiction and reality interrelate, emphasizing the nature of the text as a constructed work, an artifact of the author. While largely associated with the fiction of postmodern writers, many examples exist from earlier eras, including the 17th-century epic of Cervantes, Don Quixote, and the 18th-century hilarity of Lawrence Sterne's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler is acknowledged as one of the metafiction novel's finest modern incarnations, with a mesmerizing narrative plot that not only challenges traditional narrative forms but also asks the reader to interrogate the actual process of reading. As with the finest examples of metafictional texts, the opening words of If on a Winter's Night a Traveler immediately demand that the reader undertake a process preparatory to actually commencing the story. You are about to begin reading Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Relax. Concentrate. Dispel every other thought. Let the world around you fade. The self-reflection by Calvino in the first sentence is a typically metafictional device. Half the first chapter is a guide to you preparing for the very real task of reading this book. It is a somewhat mesmeric world, reminiscent of the metafictional playfulness of Jorge Luis Borges' work, as though Calvino has some insight into the processes of each reader's mind as they embark on reading his book. A novel about novels and points of view, Calvino's book interweaves excerpts of imagined books from different contemporary fiction genres. The titles of these 10 books form a complete sentence. A fantasy of fictions. After the meditative beginning, Calvino proceeds to plunge the reader into what appears to be a more traditional narrative plot. A character keeps starting a book, but due to various circumstances cannot continue. In his quest to finish the books, he meets a female reader who he falls in love with. He also discovers a conspiracy to render all books false and meaningless. This rather strange narrative tale is fractured by further metafictional reflection. The reader is questioned about their reaction to the book, and thereby invoked as one of the novel's protagonists. A distinct structural form runs through the novel. Each chapter is in 2 parts. The first is written in second-person form and concerned with the very process of reading. The second part, being the beginning of a new book, is seemingly an original narrative. The influence of the Oulipo, a group of French writers who experimented with new and demanding literary forms, which Calvino joined in 1968, is evident in these structural constraints. A narrative maze. If on a Winter's Night a Traveler introduces the reader to imaginary writers of fictional works that do not exist, to fabricated biographies, and even to countries that are invented, all are common traits of metafiction. The reader is guided into a narrative maze by a masterful storyteller, one who delights in playing eccentric postmodern games. The experience is utterly captivating. One reads alone, even in another's presence. If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Italo Calvino. Italo Calvino was born in Cuba in 1923 and was 2 when he moved to Italy with his parents, who were returning home. Having settled in Turin during World War II, Calvino fought for the Italian resistance, before turning to journalism at the war's end, writing for the communist paper L'Unità. Not long after the war, in 1947, his first novel, The Path to the Spider's Nests, was published. Calvino left the Italian Communist Party in 1957, after the Soviet invasion of Hungary. In 1964, he married Esther Judith Singer, resettled in Rome, and focused on the short stories that would form the collection Cosmicomics. Calvino moved with his family to Paris in 1968, where he joined the group of innovative writers known as Aleppo, short for Oeuvre de littérature potentielle. He died in 1985 from a cerebral hemorrhage. Other key works: 1957 The Baron in the Trees, 1959 The Non-Existent Night, 1965 Cosmicomics, 1972 Invisible Cities. See also, Don Quixote Fictions Hopscotch, The French Lieutenant's Woman, Midnight's Children. In context. Focus. Magic realism goes global before 1935. A Universal History of Infamy by Jorge Luis Borges is published, often considered the first work of magic realism. 1959 Günter Grass writes The Tin Drum, founding magic realism in German literature. 1967 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez takes magic realism to new heights of wonder. After 1982 Chilean-American author Isabel Allende's first novel, The House of the Spirits, becomes a global bestseller. 1984 British writer Angela Carter writes The Magic Realist Nights at the Circus. 2002 Haruki Murakami publishes the dreamlike novel Kafka on the Shore. Magic realism is a literary style in which magical or surreal elements appear in an otherwise realistic and traditional narrative structure and setting. Originally used to describe the work of certain German artists in the 1920s, the term was then applied to literature, in particular to the works emanating from Latin America in the mid-20th century. The Cuban Alejo Carpentier and the Argentinian Jorge Luis Borges are often considered the precursors of the form, while the Colombian Gabriel Garcia Marquez brought it to its peak in the boom years of the 1960s and 70s. From Latin America, magic realism spread around the world, with a number of US and European writers adopting the style, or elements of it, in their work. In Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, magic realism merges with post-colonial themes and Indian references to give the novel its unique flavor. Memory's truth. Selects, eliminates, alters, exaggerates, minimizes, glorifies, and vilifies also, but in the end it creates its own reality. Midnight's Children. Aspects of magic. Magic realist writers depict bizarre, inexplicable, or overtly supernatural events alongside ordinary events in the real world in such a way that the strange phenomena seem completely normal. Plots are often labyrinthine, and the world may be depicted in exaggerated detail or color, adding to the surreal complexity of the novel's vision. In some respects, magic realism requires the reader to take on a more active role than in other forms of fiction, because the elements of the novel are disconcerting, and may impact on the sense of reality experienced by the reader. Much magic realism also contains a metafictional aspect, which makes the reader question the way in which they read the work. Metafiction often includes a self-referential narrator, and stories within stories. Both devices are present in Midnight's Children. These manipulations of reality, magic tricks within the narrative, make demands on the reader and ensure their role is an active one. The birth of a nation. Politically, magic realist texts often embody an implicit critical position against the dominant ruling elite, and as such they are generally subversive in their stance. In Midnight's Children, the fusion of Rushdie's magic realism with post-colonial issues weaves new and vibrant threads into an already complex genre. Rushdie sets the work partly in the vast, sprawling city of Bombay, once a jewel in Britain's colonial crown and now at a crucial moment of history. Events take place as monumental political shifts are happening with the removal of British authority over India after some 200 years. At the beginning of the novel, the main protagonist Salim Sinai is approaching his 31st birthday and is convinced that he is dying. The book is ostensibly the story of Salim's life, as well as the lives of his parents and grandparents, narrated by Salim himself to his companion, Padma, but it is also the story of the creation of modern India. In the opening lines of the book Salim recounts, "I was born in the city of Bombay on August 15, 1947. On the stroke of midnight." As Salim says, "At the precise instant of India's arrival at independence, I tumbled forth into the world." He then goes on to explain, in broad hints that cannot yet be fully understood by the reader, the premise of the book. I had been mysteriously handcuffed to history, my destinies indissolubly chained to those of my country. As the narrative unfolds, it soon becomes clear that every political event appears to be driven by, or be driving, one or more events in the life of Salim. Salim's arrival at the exact moment of India's independence is wildly celebrated by the Indian media. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, sends him a letter congratulating him on the happy accident of his moment of birth, and identifies him with the nation, a role that Salim adopts, seeing himself as an important historical figure. His life is seen as closely tied to the fate of the newly born India, the bloodshed that ensues directly after partition and the fierce conflicts that occur over the following years are echoed by the concurrent violence within his own family. Salim's narration of his family's story, and of the historical events of India and Pakistan, represents his attempt to understand all the elements that make him who he is. Mumbai is a densely populated city, teeming with all forms of human life. Rushdie uses rich, vivid language to evoke its myriad elements: squalor, beauty, pathos, despair, and humor. The many and the one. Salim is marked by his large, cucumber-like, and constantly dribbling nose. At the age of 10, he discovers that he has telepathic powers. This gift allows him to discover that there were a total of 1001 midnight children, who were born in the hour after midnight on India's Independence Day. They all have marvelous superpowers, with those who were born nearest to the actual second of partition having the greatest powers. By the time Salim discovers their existence, 420 of the children have already died, and only 581 remain. Salim befriends another of the children, Parvati, who can perform magic, another of their number, Shiva, who is at once Salim's counterpart and nemesis, has incredibly strong knees and a gift for warfare. Parvati and Shiva are named after Hindu gods, thereby illustrating the religious underpinning of India as a cultural entity and adding a further layer of allegory to the novel. Using his telepathic powers to broadcast their thoughts, Salim arranges a nightly conference of the Midnight Children. There are the same number of children, 581, as there are members in the lower house of the Indian Parliament, adding political symbolism to their meetings. Their conference is a model of successful pluralism, reflecting the way the new Indian government sought to collate the disparate elements of its vast country. Rushdie implies that troubles arise when such multiplicity becomes suppressed. Perhaps, if one wishes to remain an individual in the midst of the teeming multitudes, one must make oneself grotesque. Midnight's Children. India's Independence Day on August 15, 1947 was a time of celebration, yet chaos soon struck, as Muslims and Hindus migrated between the new nations of India and Pakistan. The rush of history. As the tale of Midnight's Children unfolds, so Rushdie shifts his story across the subcontinent, employing the narrative of his characters' tales to tell the history of India, and so too of Pakistan and Kashmir. In 1962, border tensions between China and India erupted into war. It was short-lived, but India was defeated, and in the novel, public morale drains away. In Salim's life, as conflict with China intensifies, his nose gets ever more blocked until, on the day the Chinese army halts its advance, he has an operation to drain his sinuses. Once again, the events in Salim's life seem to be entwined with the wider events of history. However, with his nose finally clear, Salim finds that he has lost his mind-reading powers. In compensation, for the first time in his life he has a sense of smell. And this itself is another kind of superpower, as he can detect not only smells but also emotions and lies, the heady but quick-fading perfume of new love, and also the deeper, longer-lasting pungency of hate. Memory, truth, destiny. The novel is a kaleidoscope of Salim's memories, and yet the distinction between true and untrue is never clear, even making allowances for the outright magical elements that form part of the book's tapestry. Some characters are overt liars, while in many cases Salim admits that he has embroidered certain things in order to convey an emotional truth rather than a strictly factual one. Early on in the narrative, Salim confesses that he was switched at birth with another baby who was born at the same time. This baby was Shiva, while Salim's real parents, far from being the relatively rich Muslims who brought him up, are a colonial Englishman, William Methwold, and a poor Hindu woman who died in childbirth. So, paradoxically, the destiny he is fulfilling was that of another child, yet because he was brought up as Salim's Sinai, he considers that is who he is, it is his truth. Even historical facts cannot be regarded as unassailable. Salim notes that he recorded the wrong date for the death of Mahatma Gandhi, and yet he is content to let the error stand. In my India, Gandhi will continue to die at the wrong time. In this novel, the truth is malleable, subjective, and far from absolute. The end of the book returns to the present day, as Salim finishes telling his story to Padma. Despite his own prophecy that his body will crack apart, he agrees to marry her on his 31st birthday, which is also Independence Day. To the last, his history is intermingled with India's. Who, what am I? My answer: I am the sum total of everything that went before me, of all I have been seen done, of everything done to me. Midnight's Children. Salim's friends Shiva and Parvati are named respectively after the great Hindu god of destruction and the goddess of love, and these attributes are reflected in their roles in the book. Magical Mystery Tour. For the reader, Midnight's Children is a complex and mesmerizing journey, a mystery tour through the backstreets to the heart of modern India. Time speeds up and slows down or is non-linear. Fate is frequently invoked, futures are foretold, prophecies are listened to and expected to come true. The bizarre and the magical are commonplace and real. Weaving together all these elements of magic realism, Rushdie creates a dense and vibrant tapestry full of violence, politics, and wonder to tell the tale of the early years of independent India. Salman Rushdie. Salman Rushdie was born in Bombay in 1947 to Muslim parents of Kashmiri descent, who moved to Karachi in Pakistan soon after the partition of India. He was educated in India and Britain, attending Cambridge University, before becoming an advertising copywriter. Midnight's Children, Rushdie's second novel, brought him worldwide attention, winning the Booker Prize in 1981 and the Best of the Bookers in 2008, and establishing Rushdie as a leading light of the Indian diaspora. The appearance of the satanic verses drew great controversy when Iranian leader Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa calling for the assassination of Rushdie for blasphemy. Rushdie went into hiding in Britain. In 2000, he settled in New York and has continued to write on matters of religion and society. He has been married 4 times and was knighted in 2007. Other key works: 1983 Shame, 1988 The Satanic Verses, 2005 Shalimar the Clown. See also, The Tin Drum, 100 Years of Solitude, A Suitable Boy, The House of the Spirits, Love in the Time of Cholera. In context. Focus. Contemporary African American literature before 1953 James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain captures the pain of life in a racist society. 1976 Alex Haley's novel Roots, the saga of an American family, traces family history back to slavery. 1982 Alice Walker reveals the hardships of African American women's lives in the 1930s in The Color Purple. After 1997 Junot Diaz's sizzling prose paints a picture of the Dominican American diaspora in his story collection Drown. 1998 Edwidge Danticat recounts the 1937 massacre of Haitian cane workers in The Farming of Bones. By the end of the 20th century, African American writing had grown from the slave narratives of 150 years earlier into a major canon of American literature. From educational works such as Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery, through the vibrant literature of the 1920s Harlem Renaissance, it reached a high point with Ralph Ellison's philosophical novel Invisible Man. During the late 1950s and the 1960s, young black writers were fueled by the civil rights and black power movements. Toni Morrison's novel Beloved emerged during a new flourishing of black writing that began in the 1970s, when authors such as Alex Haley, Maya Angelou, and Alice Walker sought new ways to explore race, identity, and the legacies of slavery. This affirmation of the power of black writing has continued into the present day with hyphenated American authors, including Dominican American Junot Diaz and Haitian American Edwidge Danticat. Memory and history. In her early novels, The Bluest Eye, Sula, and Song of Solomon, Morrison focused on the African American experience within her own lifetime, offering an original voice on themes such as moral and spiritual revival, white standards of beauty, and sisterhood. Her Pulitzer prize-winning novel Beloved is regarded as one of the most influential works in African American literature. Dedicated to the 60 million and more who are believed to have died on slave ships and in captivity, it reclaims the ascendancy of memory and history in Black identity, resolving symbolically issues that are still swept aside in present-day reality. Inspired by the real-life case of Margaret Garner, a fugitive slave who killed her baby after she was recaptured by marshals in Cincinnati, Ohio, Beloved is a piece of social history with a strong political agenda, but it undermines expectations of its genre with its use of expressionist fantasy and rhetorical stylization. Morrison also asserts her roots and her pride in African folklore by incorporating the cultural focus, origins, and mythology of Black Americans into the novel. She employs the rhythms and speech patterns of African American discourse, not as a simple pastiche of Black speech but in a lyrical, incantatory voice, often making use of poetic repetitions at the beginning and the end of interior monologues. Beloved is my sister, she's mine, beloved. She's mine, I am beloved and she is mine. The author invents a feminine style of narrative built around motherhood, sisterhood, Afro-Christian revivalism, tribal rights, and ghosts. She asks the reader to engage with a retelling of history that is built on an easy intimacy with the supernatural. The book begins in 1873 in Cincinnati, Ohio. Slavery has been abolished but racism is still rife. Seeth, a former slave, and her 18-year-old daughter Denver live in a home haunted by a spiteful baby spirit named 124, after the number of their house on Bluestone Road. Seeth's 2 sons ran away years ago and her mother-in-law, Baby Suggs, is dead. The arrival of Paul D., who lived as a slave with Seeth at Sweet Home, Kentucky, starts a process that unlocks the past. Not a house in the country ain't packed to its rafters with some dead Negro's grief. Beloved. Freed slaves, such as these men photographed during the U.S. Civil War, were technically free, but they were still affected by segregation and the psychological aftermath of slavery. The past and the present. Morrison's time-traveling story slips back and forth between Seeth's present and events 20 years earlier, when slaves fleeing north were subject to fugitive slave laws that allowed owners to cross into free states to reclaim their property. Piece by piece a story emerges. Seeth and her husband, Hallie, planned a break for freedom, unable to endure their treatment at the hands of the new governor of Sweet Home, known as schoolteacher. Heavily pregnant, Seeth sent her 2 small boys and baby daughter on ahead. When Hallie failed to arrive at their agreed meeting place, Seeth traveled on alone, giving birth to her new daughter on the way, with the help of a white girl called Amy Denver. After reaching safety in Cincinnati, she found temporary happiness with her mother-in-law Baby Suggs, a freed slave. A horrific event, the details of which are revealed later in the novel, is triggered by the arrival of schoolteacher with a posse to take Seeth and her children back to the farm. Moral complexity. Good and evil are not binary opposites in this story. At its core is a terrible action committed out of profound love. The supposedly free society that sympathetic white folks offer to released slaves is built on unchallenged racism and segregation. The absurd notion of good and bad slave owners is addressed by Paul D. as he re-examines life at Sweet Home under the benign Mr. Garner. On other farms male slaves were gelded to make them manageable, but Garner's men are men. After Garner's death, the much harsher regime instituted by schoolteacher enabled them to know the real condition of their slavery for the first time, and Paul D. realizes they had only been men on home soil by virtue of Garner's protection. One step off that ground and they were trespassers among the human race. Slavery is a psychological as well as a physical condition. While slaves are bound in literal chains, shackles, gags, iron neck collars, the psychological chains that Seeth is left with as an ex-slave mean that every area of her life is infected. I never talked about it. Not to a soul. Sang it sometimes, but I never told a soul. Beloved. Remembered pain. Self-repression brought on by years of socio-political repression is a major theme in the novel. Buried memories are the emotional shards that make self-determination so hard, and which are drawn out as a psychological necessity. Morrison suggests that Black Americans can begin living in the present only by confronting the past. The fragments of earlier events in Seeth's and Paul D's lives slowly come to the surface throughout the novel, coalescing into a horrific account of slavery conditions in the South, tales that are too terrible to relate as a consecutive narrative. Rememory is the invented word that Seeth uses for the kind of remembering that takes former slaves deeper into the past to the appalling places that are always waiting to reclaim them. Seeth's rememories include the time that schoolteacher instructed his nephew to list her human and animal characteristics, and the occasion when his boys pinned her down and drank her breast milk. Paul D keeps his memories in a rusted tobacco tin buried in his chest where a red heart used to be. Baby Suggs remembers the births of 7 children from different fathers and losing them all. Beloved. The embodiment of the hurtful past is Beloved, a young woman in unspoiled shoes and a silk dress who insinuates herself into the household after Paul D drives away the baby poltergeist. This attention-seeking woman with baby-smooth skin is violently selfish and has an inexplicable knowledge of Seeth's past. Seeth is slow to recognize what for Denver is obvious. Beloved is a revenant, Seeth's dead baby grown to womanhood and craving the love she has been denied. She is the personification of Seeth's guilt, both destroyer and enabler, who coaxes out stories that have been too difficult to articulate. Her own story in Childspeak recalls the cramped hold of slave ships and bodies tipped into the sea. Beloved seems to embody the suffering of the 60 million and more, but nothing is certain. The true element to be beloved is a sense of self. Reclaiming self, a central theme in Morrison's work, is an imperative as there is nothing in the landscape for ex-slaves to own. Robbed of normal family life, mated, traded, and their offspring sold on, slaves are defined by their enslavement. Starting with these first tentative steps taken in freedom, the events in the novel presage the long road ahead. In the 1950s, the protagonist of Ellison's Invisible Man was still in search of a self, and we can hear the first notes of Martin Luther King's civil rights rhetoric in Baby Suggs' sermon in the forest. In this here place, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it. Pride in race, sex, and self is the healing medicine, because, as Paul D tells Seeth, you your best thing. African folklore traditions connect with the American present in Beloved. The character of Beloved herself appears to embody the belief that the dead return to earth in the form of spirits. Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison is one of the USA's most powerful literary voices, and the first African American woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, among her numerous other awards. Born Chloe Anthony Wofford in 1931 into a working-class Ohio family, she grew up with a love of reading, music, and folklore. She gained a BA degree from Howard University and an MA from Cornell. She was married for a short time to Jamaican architect Harold Morrison, with whom she had 2 sons. Morrison wrote her first 4 novels while working as an editor in New York. Her 5th, Beloved, was widely acclaimed and adapted into a film. From 1989 to 2006, Morrison held a professorship at Princeton University. In 2005, she wrote the libretto for Margaret Garner, an opera based on the story that inspired Beloved. She continues to write and to speak against censorship and repression of history. Other key works: 1970, The Bluest Eye; 1977, Song of Solomon; 2008, A Mercy; 2012, Home. See also, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, Their Eyes Were Watching God; Invisible Man; I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings; Roots, The Saga of an American Family. In context. Focus. Root-seeking movement before. 1981, A Preliminary Inquiry into the Techniques of Modern Fiction, an essay by future Nobel Prize winner Gao Xingjian, lays the groundwork for the Shuangin movement. 1985, La Sabes Joshidawa's story, Tibet, A Soul Knotted on a Leather Thong, draws upon Tibetan folk culture and traditions. 1985, Wang Ani's novella Bao Town minutely depicts harsh village life in northern China. 1985, Beijing writer Qing publishes Romances of the Landscape, describing border areas far from civilization. After. 1996, in a dictionary of Maqiao Han Xiaogong uses etymology and vignettes to examine life in the Cultural Revolution. In the Shuangin, or root-seeking, movement that arose in Chinese literature during the mid-1980s, writers tried to reconnect with folk culture. The movement took its name from a 1985 essay by Han Xiaogong, The Roots of Literature, which called on writers to seek out forgotten sources of creativity. While some Xuangan authors examined China's ethnic minorities, others took a fresh look at the indigenous values within Taoism and Confucianism. For decades, Chinese writing had been on a strict diet of realism. In harking back to folk influences, the Xuangan authors also introduced elements of the supernatural. The new work brought Chinese writers to the attention of the literary world again for the first time in decades. Redefining modernity. One of the movement's most famous books is Red Sorghum by Guan Moi, better known by his pen name Mo Yen. Red sorghum is named after a rare wheat crop, whose color symbolizes vitality, bloodshed, and stability. Set in northwest China's rural Shandong province, the book follows one family from 1923 to 1976, through the Japanese occupation, the Communist Revolution, and the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. As a true root-seeking novel, Red Sorghum incorporates mythical and folkloric elements, and its break with the chronological structures that accompanied the realistic tradition gave new energy to Chinese literary modernism. Lines of scarlet figures shuttled along the sorghum stalks to weave a vast human tapestry. Red Sorghum. See also, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Call to Arms, Playing for Thrills. In context. Focus. Australian writing before 1957. Patrick White, one of the most influential modern Australian writers, uses religious symbolism in Voss, a story of a visionary explorer's encounter with Australia in the mid-19th century. 1982. Thomas Keneally's Schindler's Ark mixes fact and fiction to explore the impact of an individual on historical events. After 2001. Peter Carey is awarded a second Booker Prize for his novel The True History of the Kelly Gang, an imaginative take on the legendary Australian hero Ned Kelly. 2006. Indigenous writer Alexis Wright explores the dispossession of Aboriginal lands by white people in her novel Carpentaria. Australian writers have attracted international interest since the middle of the 20th century. Novelists have moved from traditional themes such as mateship, national pride, and rural survival, to create works that are provocative and often disturbing. The areas explored by these books include fantasy, beliefs, and personal relationships, while being rooted in the Australian experience. One of the leading writers and creators of this modern genre is Australian novelist and former advertising copywriter, Peter Carey. His Oscar and Lucinda, which won the Booker Prize in 1988, is a rich and complex novel set in the mid-19th century, with events taking place in England and New South Wales. Guilt and Faith. The protagonists of the book are Oscar Hopkins and Lucinda Leplastrier. The former is a young clergyman who grapples with his faith, an ungainly, uncomfortable individual, brought up in an English seaside community. The latter is an independent-minded young woman, who grew up in an earth-floored hut in New South Wales, surrounded by the works of Dickens, Balzac, and other literary greats. Becoming an heiress after her mother's death, Lucinda buys an old glassworks in Sydney, where she is regarded as odd because of her aloofness and strange behavior. The pair meet on board ship traveling from Britain to Australia, and from then on their lives are interlinked, coming together in an extraordinary project to build and transport a glass church through the Australian bush. While on one level Oscar and Lucinda is a historical novel, it is also steeped in fantasy and unreality. Peter Carey described it as a science fiction of the past. Its rich and complex characters, descriptive storytelling, and broad-ranging themes of faith, belief, and sexuality ensured its influence on modern Australian literature. See also, The Three Musketeers, The Lagoon, and Other Stories. In context. Focus. Caribbean writing before 1949. Cuban writer Alejo Carpentier publishes his novel The Kingdom of This World, which negotiates Caribbean history and culture. 1953. In the Castle of My Skin, by Barbadian writer George Lamming, is one of the region's key autobiographical novels and wins the Somerset Maugham Award in 1957. 1960. In Return to My Native Land, Martinican poet M. Césaire discusses negritude, or black consciousness, as a form of identity for people whose ancestors had been dislocated from Africa. After 1995 To Us, All Flowers Are Roses, Poems confirms Lorna Goodison as one of the finest Jamaican poets of the post-war generation. History and memory have always been a part of the Caribbean literary landscape, and writing from the region has highlighted the struggle to find a truthful voice that reflects the reality of alienation in a colonial situation. Caribbean authors, contingent on who their island's previous colonial owners were, write in Spanish, French, English, or Dutch. Each writer negotiates the known fragments of his or her own history within the particular post-colonial situation. Intertwined narratives. A towering figure in this literary landscape is St. Lucian author Derek Walcott. In 1992 he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature for a poetic oeuvre of great luminosity, sustained by a historical vision, the outcome of a multicultural commitment. Walcott's magnificent and hugely ambitious 300-page poem Omeros endorses the judge's claim. Epic in length, it references Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, while also celebrating the landscape, people, and language of St. Lucia. The poem follows Dante's The Divine Comedy in its use of terza rima, a three-line poetic form, or tercet, in which the second line rhymes with the first and third lines of the next tercet. At the same time, Walcott honors the tone and rhythm of the local Caribbean patois from the very beginning of the poem. While some of the characters' names, such as Achille and Hector, are classical in origin, they are also not unusual names for St. Lucian fishermen. Omeros interweaves time and place to interrogate topics such as slavery, American Indian genocide, and expatriates in the Caribbean. Walcott fuses stories from Africa, the USA, London, and Ireland with St. Lucian events to create a mosaic narrative of collective memory. Island life, memories of Africa, and the vestiges of colonialism remain the focus for Caribbean writers as they attempt to make sense of their disjointed histories. See also, Iliad Odyssey The Divine Comedy Ulysses A House for Mr. Biswas. In context. Focus. Transgressive fiction before 1973 The protagonists of English writer J. G. Ballard's controversial novel Crash are a group of car crash victims who are sexually aroused by car accidents. 1984 Foreshadowing later transgressive fiction, U.S. writer J. McInerney's satire Bright Lights, Big City places the reader as the central character in a hollow world. After 1992 Brutal and shocking, Irish writer Patrick McCabe's The Butcher Boy plunges the reader into the violent fantasy world of schoolboy Francie Brady. 1996 Tyler Durden, the antihero in U.S. writer Chuck Palahniuk's transgressive Fight Club, is an anarchic, masochistic nihilist. The explicit treatment of taboo topics such as rape, incest, pedophilia, drugs, and violence characterizes transgressive fiction, a genre that came to the fore in the 1990s. Writers such as Charles Bukowski, William S. Burroughs, J. G. Ballard, and Kathy Acker had paved the way in previous decades with novels that variously described weird sexual acts, body mutilation, drug use, and extreme violence. To transgress is to go beyond established moral boundaries, and American Psycho, a black comedy by U.S. author Bret Easton Ellis, does this with relish. Its scenes of violence, particularly against women, have led to calls for the book to be banned. Psychotic Dream. Its true transgression, however, lies perhaps in the suggestion that the pursuit of the American dream is akin to a mental disorder. The book is set in Manhattan during the 1980s Wall Street boom, and the narrator, Patrick Bateman, is both a yuppie and a homicidal sociopath. He inhabits a morally bankrupt, drug-dependent world that revolves around designer clothes and exclusive clubs and restaurants. He expounds his love of a rock band in the same tone as he ponders how to dispose of a corpse. Forced to view the world through his eyes, the reader is urged to question a society in which everything has become commodified. I have all the characteristics of a human being, blood, flesh, skin, hair, but not a single, clear, identifiable emotion, except for greed and disgust. American Psycho. See also, Lolita: A Clockwork Orange Crash. In context. Focus. Indian English writing before 1950s. R. K. Narayan's texts help introduce Indian English writing to a global readership. 1981 Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children marks a new stage in Indian English writing. After 1997 Arundhati Roy wins the Booker Prize with The God of Small Things, which challenges the caste system. 2000 Amitabh Ghosh looks at migration and colonial control in The Glass Palace, a historical novel set in Burma, Bengal, India, and Malaya. 2006 In The Inheritance of Loss, Indian English author Kiran Desai explores the impact of colonialism. Over the last few decades, Indian English writing has carved a niche as a recognizable literary genre that has gained increasing international attention. In the 1950s and 60s, some Indian writers, notably R. K. Narayan, one of the first Indian English novelists to be recognized outside India, made a deliberate choice to write about the Indian experience in English rather than in one of the numerous Indian languages or dialects. Most of these earlier Indian English novelists were writing from within India, portraying everyday experiences. Since the 1980s, however, a new generation of Indian English novelists has emerged, most of whom have chosen to focus on the themes of post-colonial India, including the impact of imperialism, religious tensions, and the caste system. Intertwined stories. Salman Rushdie was one of the first of the so-called Indian diasporic novelists, Indian writers living outside India. His Booker Prize-winning Midnight's Children, with its blend of Hindi myth, Bombay cinema, magic realism, and hybrid use of English peppered with Indian terms, is the starting point of what has been described as a renaissance in Indian English literature, mainly produced by diasporic authors. Several writers followed Rushdie, including Vikram Seth, whose novel A Suitable Boy was published in 1993. Epic in scale, A Suitable Boy is one of the longest novels in the English language. Set in the early 1950s, soon after India's independence and partition in 1947, the novel follows the fortunes of 4 families over a period of 18 months. 3 of the families, the Mehras, Chatterjees, and Kapoors, all of whom are middle-class, educated Hindus, are related to one another by marriage. The 4th family, the aristocratic, Muslim Khans, are friends of the Kapoors. The novel opens in the fictional town of Brahmpur, on the river Ganges between Banaras and Patna, although events also take place in Calcutta, Delhi, and Kanpur. These places are described with immense richness, and often with wit. Seth recreates, in magnificent, almost photographic, detail the India of the early 1950s, bringing to vivid life the river Ganges, the crowded, bustling streets and markets, the country's extremes of wealth and poverty, and its wonderfully varied landscapes. Central to the text is the determination of Mrs. Rupa Mehra to arrange the marriage of her younger daughter Lata, a 19-year-old university student, to a suitable boy. Towns along the river Ganges pulsate with life and color, providing a vibrant backdrop to the interweaving stories and multiple realities of the India evoked by Seth's narrative. "You too will marry a boy I choose," said Mrs. Rupa Mehra firmly to her younger daughter. A suitable boy. The personal and political. The novel begins with a wedding, that of Lata's elder sister Savita to Pran Kapoor, a young university professor from a prominent family. Although he suffers from asthma, he qualifies as a suitable boy. Lata, an independent-minded young woman whose thoughts and actions in many ways mirror the changes occurring in India at the time, has mixed feelings about the marriage of her beloved sister, questioning how a woman can marry a man she does not know. As the novel progresses, Lata herself falls in love with 3 young men, Kabir, a Muslim student, Amit, an internationally celebrated poet, and Haresh, a determined businessman in the shoe trade. It is not until the last moment that the reader learns which of the 3 Lata chooses. Significantly, it is a decision that she makes for herself, taking account of her mother's wishes, social realities, and her own feelings about love and passion. And yet A Suitable Boy is much more than just a romantic plot, incorporating numerous subplots, both personal and political, and a large and finely drawn cast of characters. These range from the widowed Mrs. Rupa Mehra, with her tireless meddling in the lives of her 4 children, to the young Muslim idealist Rashid, from the strong-minded Malati, Lata's best friend, to the young mathematical genius Bhaskar, and from the politician Mahesh Kapoor to the musician Ishak. Real historical figures, such as India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, are also added to the literary mix. A Suitable Boy provides a detailed account of the social and political events taking place in post-partition India during the formative years of the Nehru period. Woven into the text are key issues such as the value of work, the process of change, the injustice of poverty, and the direction being taken by India. It describes the run-up to the post-independence election of 1952, in which the Kapoor family is closely involved. Religious intolerance, in particular Hindu-Muslim tensions, is revealed in the reactions to Lata's love for Kabir and to Pran's younger brother Man's relationship with a Muslim Sinjar courtesan, Sita Bai, and, more violently, in a near riot between Hindus and Muslims over plans to erect a Hindu temple near a mosque. The author also depicts the iniquities of the caste system, poverty, and the status of lower caste Indians, such as the Jadhav, who scraped their living in the evil-smelling tanneries. Certain parts of the plot revolve around land reforms and the abolition of the zamindari system, which aimed to remove property from large aristocratic landholders. The novel explores the roles of women in 1950s India, too, comparing Lata's dependence on her family with the independence of her friend Malati and the Muslim custom of purdah, in which women are segregated and wear form-covering clothes such as the burqa. Lata has a tough choice to make: should she choose the Muslim student, the internationally acclaimed poet, or the businessman as her partner? Her plight echoes that of post-partition India. Should it opt to overcome religious factionalism, to strive for a sophisticated internationalism, or to settle for economic stability? Real-life concerns. Unlike Rushdie's magical India, Seth's novel focuses on the matters of real life: work, love, family, the intricacies of lawmaking, political intrigue, the academic world, and religious tensions. These are presented in beautifully written and lyrical prose that is compelling, eminently readable, and often amusing. It presents the English language as it is spoken by the people of India, embellished with scatterings of Hindu and Muslim terms, many of which do not translate into English. The Indian English novelist Anita Desai has observed that it was only after Rushdie that Indian writers finally felt capable of using the spoken language, spoken English, the way it's spoken on Indian streets by ordinary people, something that Seth also captures perfectly. Marriage lies at the heart of A Suitable Boy and is used to explore key issues, from religion, class, gender, and politics to national and personal identity. Language of imperialists. Vikram Seth is a skilled and renowned poet as well as a novelist, so it is perhaps unsurprising that his text includes superbly poetic passages. Many of these draw the reader into the world of Urdu poetry, Indian music and singing, and myths and legends as sung and played by Sita Bai and her musicians. Equally haunting are descriptions of a tiger hunt, the stinking pools of the tanning works, the Indian countryside, and the Kumbh Mela festival. The novel also includes the flippant couplets nonchalantly tossed out by the Chatterjees, and a contents page that comprises 19 rhyming couplets, one for each part of the book. It took Seth more than 8 years to write his monumental novel. It was a huge success and was awarded the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. He has been compared to Jane Austen. But although A Suitable Boy, like Austen's novels, deals with family events and is realistic and perceptive, it is unmistakably an Indian novel, written in English, and a landmark of the genre. There have been fierce debates concerning the validity of Indian English literature, and in particular a questioning of why leading Indian novelists, most of whom live outside India, should even be writing in English. In Rushdie's words, the ironic proposition that India's best writing since independence may have been done in the language of the departed imperialists is simply too much for some folks to bear. Nevertheless, the popularity of the Indian English genre continued to grow into the 21st century, with writers such as Arundhati Roy, Jhumpa Lahiri, Amitabh Ghosh, and Kiran Desai making significant contributions, either setting their novels in India or focusing on the experience of rootlessness and alienation in the diaspora. They agreed with each other violently and disagreed with each other pleasurably. A Suitable Boy. Vikram Seth. The son of a businessman and a judge, Vikram Seth was born in 1952 in Calcutta, India. After leaving the Doon School, he completed his schooling in Tunbridge, England, and went on to Oxford University, where he graduated in philosophy, politics, and economics. He received a master's degree in economics from Stanford University, USA, and later spent some time in China, where he studied classical Chinese poetry. He now lives in England but keeps close contact with India. Seth's written works include poetry, a children's book, and 3 novels. In 2009 he announced that he was working on a sequel to A Suitable Boy, entitled A Suitable Girl. Initially due to finish the novel in 2013, he commented on BBC's radio program Desert Island Discs in 2012 that the pace of work was slow. The sound of deadlines pushing past is one of the sounds that authors are most familiar with. Other key works: 1986 The Golden Gate, 1999 An Equal Music, 2005 Two Lives. See also, Midnight's Children, Interpreter of Maladies. In context. Focus. The campus novel before. 1951 U.S. writer Mary McCarthy's The Groves of Academe is published. It is considered one of the first academic or campus novels. 1954 The influential book Lucky Jim, by English writer Kingsley Amis, develops the campus genre further through a plot that follows a young history lecturer making his way in a post-war world. 1990 The Booker Prize-winning novel Possession, a romance, by English novelist A.S. Byatt, details a postmodern historical mystery set in an academic world. After 2000 The Human Stain by U.S. writer Philip Roth follows the complex life story of a retired classics professor and the shifting world of U.S. academia. When U.S. author Donna Tartt published her novel The Secret History, it was recognized as a striking addition to the campus novel genre, which it both borrows from and extends. Academic novels developed in the 1950s, when the concerns of post-war society were linked with the literary and cultural debates taking place on Western campuses. These novels, set within the confined space of a university, often satirize academic life and the pretentiousness of scholars. The allure of civilization. The Secret History follows a group of 6 classics students at an elite New England university. Using this setting to focus on various literary and cultural debates, Tartt expands on her 1950s predecessor's use of a university environment to question the role of literature, identity, and the genre itself. Tartt's novel is an anti-detective story that complicates the 19th-century detective genre. The book opens with a murder mystery plot, but it is the motive, not the identity of the perpetrator, that mystifies the reader and is gradually revealed as the plot unfolds. Tartt uses the premise of a hidden murder among the 6 students to explore wider ideas. Borrowing from Greek tragedy, she compels her reader to question whether the tragic flaw in character, a feature of that genre, does indeed exist. She explores this question through the plot to interrogate how and why we use the literary past in the present. A philosophical murder. For Tartt's student characters, the literary is all too real. It is taken to an explicitly literal extreme in the form of a murder that pays homage to the philosophical idea that death is the mother of beauty, as one student, Henry, declares. Whether the murder is indeed to be interpreted as a playful and self-conscious literary device that draws from academic theory, or perhaps as a critique of theory itself, is something that Tartt leaves for her reader to decide. See also, Oedipus the King Disgrace. In context. Focus. Writing for the world before. 1987 The hero of Murakami's Norwegian Wood, a nostalgic tale of friendship, love, and loss, is a former college student interested in U.S. literature. 1988 Banana Yoshimoto's Kitchen tells a wistful story of a young Japanese woman, for whom the consumer opulence of Western-style cooking provides an emotional refuge. After 1997 Ryu Murakami's In the Miso Soup is a crime story set among the hostess bars of Tokyo, with conversational references to real-life Americans such as Whitney Houston and Robert De Niro. 2002 Kafka on the Shore shows Murakami exploring metaphysical fantasy, in a Japan where westernized culture and Shintoism meet. From the late 20th century, globalization, in particular the spread of U.S. popular culture around the world, has created a forum in which writers have been able to free their fiction of localized traditions, as if writing for a universal readership. U.S. influences are particularly evident in Japanese culture, stemming, in part, from the U.S. occupation of Japan. Japanese author Haruki Murakami has a cultural background that seems half American. He translated F. Scott Fitzgerald and Truman Capote into Japanese, and ran a jazz club in Tokyo. East meets West. Murakami's novel The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle calls on American influences, as well as cultural motifs from Europe. For example, it begins with its hero, Toru Okada, listening to Rossini while cooking pasta. Later in the novel, a baseball bat is used as a weapon. The book itself is a complex quest narrative with its roots in Western culture. As Orpheus visits the underworld to bring back Eurydice in Greek myth, so Okada descends into a well to recover his wife Kumiko after she disappears. Yet this is still a Japanese story at its core. Murakami evokes the alienation of modern urban Japan, while at the same time probing Japanese history. For instance, Lieutenant Mamiya's tales of wartime exploits in Manchuria and a Soviet prison camp address Japan's violent war record. Is it possible for one human being to achieve perfect understanding of another? The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. See also, Playing for Thrills. In context. Focus allegorical satire. Before 1605 in Don Quixote, Miguel de Cervantes explores the inability to see the world as it really is, in his main character's delusional quest to enact a knight's saga. 1726 Anglo-Irish writer Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels exaggerates moral and political corruption in tales of fantastical cultures. 1945 in Animal Farm, English author George Orwell traces the parallels between the degeneration of politics in human society and a caste of rebellious farm animals. After 2008, 10 U.S. writer Suzanne Collins publishes The Hunger Games, using allegorical satire to indicate the power of media as a political tool in contemporary U.S. society. José Saramago's harrowing novel Blindness is an example of allegorical satire, a type of narrative that has a parallel subtext that is often moral or political in nature. In allegorical satire, events are used explicitly or implicitly as metaphors to ridicule aspects of society, politics, or life. In Blindness, the satire is inspired by Portugal's Estado Novo, an authoritarian regime that ruled the country from 1933 to 1974, although the novel's actual settings, characters, and times are left ambiguous. Under scrutiny is the lack of morality, kindness, and empathy typical of any right-wing capitalist society. What if we were all blind? The novel describes events after people in a city of an unnamed country start going blind, not a dark blindness, but a milky, pearl-white blindness. The affliction spreads via human contact or presence and is incurable. The government transfers those affected to a guarded asylum, and leaves them to fend for themselves, with food and cleaning equipment as their only aids. As a form of society, based on solidarity, begins to emerge among the blinded, fueled by need, survival, and a return of human empathy, we see the main characters grow as members of a community. Saramago describes the physical and psychological struggles of the newly blinded as a parallel to people who have lost sight of reason, humanity, and the very idea of human society. These blind internees will soon turn into animals, worse still, into blind animals. The arrival of a group of organized blind thugs becomes an added element of oppression, with obvious political connotations of the violence and terror of a totalitarian regime. Saramago gives his narrative unstoppable force by minimizing punctuation and switching between tenses and perspectives. This creates a sense of being propelled through the story, thus echoing the themes of the narrative. Portugal's repressive Estado Novo regime is an unspoken presence in Saramago's text. The book's title and contents gesture to a parallel theme of a dark and sinister political blindness. Blindness and insight. The reader is given an added perspective on the bleak situation through the eyes of the doctor's wife, one of the first internees, but one who feigns blindness to be with her husband. This device allows for an enhanced understanding of the bonds being created, the habits being abandoned, and the ideologies being formed and reformed in the story. It is through the doctor's wife that the characters discover one another, and find hope and the strength to survive the white blindness, the cruelty of the thugs, and the harshness of the asylum. It is thanks to her humanity and her empathy, symbols of the type of society towards which people should be striving, that, ultimately, they start to rebuild a life outside the asylum. José Saramago. José de Sousa Saramago was born in Portugal in 1922, the son of poor rural workers. His parents could not afford to send him to school, so he trained as a mechanic. Only later did his talent for writing lead him into work as a translator, journalist, and editor. A politically engaged man, Saramago found that his first novel, Land of Sin, was not well received by the conservative Catholic regime of Estado Novo, which blocked the book's production. He resurfaced in 1966 with possible poems and, after writing more novels, received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1998. He moved to Spain following the Portuguese government's censorship of one of his books in 1992. He lived there until his death in 2010. Other key works: 1982 Baltasar and Blamunda. 1984 The year of the death of Ricardo Reis. 1991 The Gospel according to Jesus Christ. 2004 Seeing. See also, The Divine Comedy, The Canterbury Tales, Don Quixote, Candide, Gulliver's Travels, Animal Farm, Lord of the Flies. In context. Focus. South African literature before 1883. Olive Schreiner explores patriarchal and gender issues against a colonial backdrop in The Story of an African Farm. 1948 The best-selling Cry, The Beloved Country by Alan Paton exposes South Africa's politics of oppression to the world. 1963 90,000s of books are banned as undesirable in South Africa. 1991 Writer and activist Nadine Gordimer is awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. After 2000 Writer Nozak's MDA experiments with a complex mix of Xhosa history, myth, and colonial conflict in his novel The Heart of Redness. 2003 Damon Galgut's The Good Doctor picks apart the promise of political change. An extraordinary canon of literature has evolved in South Africa from a society in which the black majority was oppressed for decades by colonialism and apartheid, a tyrannical system of segregation. Writing during and after apartheid falls very broadly into two camps. Authors such as Nobel Prize winner Nadine Gordimer produced complex novels that are a testimony to history, rooted in social realism and the politics of their era. In comparison, J. M. Coetzee appears almost socially irresponsible in producing texts that rival history. His stories are characterized by ambiguity and elusiveness, with a postmodern preoccupation with the language of their production and the authority of the speaking voice. Power relations. Coetzee's novel Disgrace centers on the downfall of David Lurie, a professor in classics and modern languages who is reduced to teaching communications. A cipher for the lost certainties of whites from old European stock in the new South Africa, Lurie finds that communication fails him. He cannot engage his students, nor use poetry to seduce Melanie, a student whom he effectively rapes during an affair. After Lurie is plunged into disgrace and dismissed from his job, the story shifts to the Eastern Cape, where his daughter Lucy runs a smallholding. Lurie sees glimpses of an idealized rural past, but struggles with the changing order between white landowners and their black employees and neighbors. He fills his time helping to dispatch neglected animals in a rural veterinary clinic. The professor speaks several European languages, but cannot engage with Lucy's neighbor Petrus. Pressed into the mold of English, Petrus's story would come out arthritic, bygone. He has no African words to reason with the three black youths who attack the farm and rape his daughter, nor can he unveil her neighbor's complicity. Later, at a celebration of Petrus's new status as landlord, a guest takes center stage to narrate in the Xhosa language a future that only the blacks can understand. Repentance belongs to another world, to another universe of discourse. Disgrace. An uncertain future. Disgrace, published 5 years after the first free elections in South Africa, sits in stark contrast to post-apartheid, honeymoon literature, suffused with the optimism of the new nation. Condemned by some for its violent storyline, the novel is finely balanced in its portrayal of a state of disgrace that has no cultural boundaries. In the end, there is a parody between the attack on Lucy and the professor's sexual abuse of black prostitutes and the student Melanie, who is assumed to be of mixed race. While Lurie refuses to speak at his hearing from arrogance, Lucy's silence about her ordeal suggests a realization that life has to be stripped back to the basics because there are no words available to repair or heal. J. M. Coetzee. Novelist, linguist, essayist, and translator John Michael Coetzee was born in 1940 to English-speaking Afrikaner parents. Coetzee spent his early life in Cape Town and Worcester in the Western Cape. After graduating in the 1960s, he worked as a computer programmer in London. He has a PhD in English, linguistics, and Germanic languages from the University of Texas. From 1972, Coetzee held posts at the University of Cape Town, finishing in 2000 as Distinguished Professor of Literature, and taught frequently in the USA. He has won a raft of literary awards, including the Booker Prize and the 2003 Nobel Prize in Literature. Coetzee now lives in South Australia and is an advocate for animal rights.